Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Canada Leaders panel, where I'm virtually alongside some of Canada's thought leaders in the gaming industry. My name is Chantal Gibriano. I'm the Senior Director of Legal and Compliance with Mazuma. Mazuma is a fintech company that provides payment solutions to online gaming operators across the globe. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today, including our panelists. I'd like to dive right into all the exciting changes that are going on here in Canada. But first, I will turn it over to each panelist to introduce themselves. So I'd like to start off with Dave.
My name is Dave Phillips, and I am the Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Registrar at the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. My professional background is primarily in law and politics. Prior to joining the AGCO, I was the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General of Ontario and an executive at the Ontario Cannabis Retail Corporation. Really look forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, Dave. Ron?
Good morning, everyone. It's Ron Segev here. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada, so you have us from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Lakes this morning. I am the founding partner of Segev LLP. We're a full solutions business firm specializing in gaming and betting. Recently ranked by Chambers and Partners as one of the top gaming firms in the country. And we represent industry participants across the spectrum with their affairs in Canada, and then with their affairs from Canada when they're based in Canada. Quite happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Paul?
Good morning. I'm Paul Burns, President and CEO of the Canadian Gaming Association, and we're the national trade association for the gaming industry in Canada, representing operators and suppliers to Canada's gaming industry, from online providers to land-based gaming, and good members like the folks at Mazuma and FinTech Center. So we're been around for about 15 years now, and look forward to having a discussion today.
Thanks, everyone. Kevin will be joining us shortly. There are a couple technical issues, so he will introduce himself briefly when he joins. So I'm going to move into our first hot topic of the day, which is Ontario's iGaming regime. There's been a lot of movement in Ontario with regards to the competitive iGaming model that is going to allow for private operators, which is a stark contrast from the government monopoly that we have been used to. With that said, I'd like to start off with you, Dave. What changes are on the horizon when it comes to iGaming in Ontario, including the structure of the new model?
To your question, I do want to take a moment to thank the conference organizers for having me. You've done a really remarkable job of putting on a first-rate digital conference, and it's been very impressive so far. And also thank you, Chantal. You have shepherded us over the last couple of weeks to get ready for today's panel and showed a lot of deep expertise and knowledge in the industry to set up a really good discussion. So thanks very much. Now, in response to your question, a couple of weeks ago, Ontario's Minister of Finance introduced the Ontario budget into the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and it included the introduction of legislation that really marks or paves the way for two pretty historic changes. The first is pretty straightforward that I suspect lots who are watching will be very well aware of. The legislation, if it passes, will pave the way for Ontario to become the first province in Canada to move into an open, competitive, and domestically regulated internet gaming marketplace. To this point in time, every province that does have regulated iGaming essentially has a state-conducted and managed monopoly with a single site being run. So this is going to really change the game substantially in Ontario. The second change is a little bit more inside baseball with respect to Ontario, but nonetheless is a pretty significant change, and it's tied to our historical institutional framework, both across Canada and in Ontario. And that flows from the fact that the Criminal Code of Canada is quite anomalous relative to most jurisdictions around the world, and that it requires that a provincial government not only regulate gaming activities, most gaming activities, but also that the province conduct and manage gaming activities. And that has meant in Ontario that historically we have two government agencies, one that is there to regulate and one that is there to provide commercial oversight. Well, this legislation will actually put both hats on the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, where we will serve as both the regulator and as the commercial oversight body within one agency. So that's a pretty significant change that only applies to internet gaming But nonetheless, that's the direction that the province is going.
Great. I'm not sure what just happened there, but I received a large video on my screen. Okay, moving on. We know that there's been some consultations between the AGCO and industry over the past year, and which are going to continue on into next year. Dave, can you tell us a bit more about the process and what key items the AGCO is looking at?
Yeah, for sure. So this change was actually foreshadowed early last year in last year's budget. So legislation wasn't introduced until a couple of weeks ago, but there were indications that the province was going to potentially move in this direction. So shortly thereafter, the AGCO led a round of technical consultations where a team from the AGCO as well as some others were meeting with operators, suppliers, regulators from around the world for a series of technical consultations. There was really two segments to it. One was a series of in-person discussions and then some written conversations and written consultations. And there are two areas of focus. The first was just to give ourselves a good sense of exactly where the market is at and get a sense of how operators and suppliers are operating today. Obviously, we have a degree of familiarity, but we wanted to make sure that we had a full picture into everything from data management, player management, and so forth. In addition to that, we wanted to have a conversation with regulators around the world to get a picture of the different regulatory models that were in place and how that could potentially affect Ontario's approach. So we have been at the business of gaming regulation, both land-based and more recently iGaming with respect to OLG.ca for many years. So we're a pretty mature regulator in that respect, but we also want to make sure that we're modernizing our framework to reflect an open competitive market. Looking forward, what you're going to see moving into 2021 is a far more formal and open consultation process. And you're probably going to see two streams, I anticipate. The first will be primarily led by provincial ministries, in particular the Ministry of Finance, that will be focused on some of the big questions with respect to revenue and financial model, First Nations consultation, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit for a few minutes. And then on top of that, the AGCO will be leading some formal consultations that are really heavily focused on a regulatory model to shape our approach to eligibility with respect to individuals and entities and technology, matters respecting responsible gambling, anti-money laundering, and kind of on down the line. So that's going to take place next year. I could say that the AGCO is dedicating a really significant share of our resources at the leadership level to make sure that we do a good job of standing this up. A gentleman by the name of Doug Hood has been established to serve as the lead with respect to the conduct and manage activities, and our chief strategy officer and chief information officer will also be serving as the leads for the organization.
Great, thank you. We look forward to hearing more about those consultations in future. Just getting more into the nitty-gritty details, responsible advertising and marketing has always been a strong consideration in this industry. Does Ontario have any sense of how a licensee will be able to advertise and market their product? And will they work in conjunction with organizations like Advertising Standards Canada? Dave, this is another question for you.
We're going to share the love in a second, right? So it's a really good question. Obviously, advertising and marketing when it comes to a competitive and domestically regulated online gaming market is a very significant issue in many jurisdictions around the world, and one that we'll be spending a lot of time on. I can say that the AGCO already has shifted to what we refer to as a standards-based regulatory framework, where we have what's referred to as the Registrar Standards for Gaming that you can get on the website of the AGCO, and we already have in place a series of standards specifically on the subject of gaming advertising and marketing that applies to the internet gaming world and focuses on the things you'd expect, prohibitions on the targeting of minors and self-excluded individuals, ensuring that marketing is conducted in an honest fashion and that it's not misleading and so forth, but fully recognize that an open competitive and domestically regulated market is going to introduce a whole new range of issues, and that there's been a lot of policy reform in this area, quite frankly, around the globe. So our consultations next year will be focused in part on that. Specifically, with respect to Advertising Standards Council, I'm aware that in different parts of the world, there's different, kind of institutional dynamics as to who plays the lead when it comes to the regulation of advertising and marketing. In some cases, it's a body exclusively focused on advertising and marketing regulations. in Ontario, I'll say at least, the AGCO, we're an integrated regulator, so we regulate not just gaming, but also the cannabis retail industry, horse racing, and the alcohol industry as well. And we've assumed responsibility with respect to many of those verticals in the area of advertising and marketing, and I expect that's going to be the same thing for iGaming.
Ron, I suspect that this question has or may have been asked by some of your clients. Do you have any comments on the advertising and marketing topic? Any considerations, perhaps speculations?
Yeah, it's a subject that comes up pretty often from our client base. First, I don't think we can overstate how exciting the market opportunity is in Ontario, and I think it might be useful just for context if we've got international viewership that they understand that Ontario, in some respects, represents half the Canadian market. And if you want to put it in a more global context, I heard from someone yesterday that the New Jersey market is the third largest sports betting market in the world now. From a population perspective, Ontario is almost twice as large. So I think we can expect some very interesting things to happen as a result of the shift in this regime. With respect to the marketing question, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely on point. As we know, it's possible to get an affiliate license in various of the United States. And as we also know, marketing activity is tightly regulated in the UK, and not just regulated, but they keep a watch on those things. And frequently in the news we see some of the operators reprimanded for some commercials or advertising that pushed the envelope. My thinking on the matter is that traditionally provinces don't have a lot of experience working with affiliates. So these third-party advertisers. And as part of the consultation process, if they're not doing it already, I urge them to reach out to the larger affiliates, or at least a coalition of affiliates called RAIG, which is Responsible Affiliates in Gaming, just to get an idea of some of the funky stuff that could happen in the affiliate space. And not just traditional affiliates, but also within the influencer space. Influencers are taking an increasing role in forwarding traffic to operators. And oftentimes they don't have the sophistication or the sensitivity to understand ideas around responsible gaming. So I'd really like to see AGCO work very closely with the advertising industry and gaming, just to make sure that they have all their bases covered there.
Dave, on that topic of affiliates, as we know, the role is quite formalized in the US. Is Ontario contemplating this?
Yeah, so we don't have an express dedicated licensing instrument for affiliates in Ontario at this point in time, simply because our regulated gaming market as it exists right now doesn't really command it. But certainly aware of the fact, and it's been a big part of our conversations over the past year, that there's different regulatory approaches to affiliate marketing in different jurisdictions, whether it be putting the obligation on the operator, which is obviously the historical approach in certain European jurisdictions, or having an express licensing instrument, or a licensing instrument that kind of folds into your supplier approach with some carved out rules specifically for affiliates. So this is one where I'll say we will be very closely consulting on it over the course of the next year and determining what our approach is going to be.
Great, thank you. So without a doubt, and I think, Dave, you've already alluded to this, another crucial part of the industry here is the involvement of First Nations. How are First Nations going to be treated under this model?
Well, I think just for the international nature of the viewership, maybe a little bit of context on the Canadian reality when it comes to First Nations, Indigenous communities, and gaming. It's a little bit different, at least in Ontario, than a lot of other markets. Recognizing the U.S. and in MPWA's home province of Saskatchewan, you tend to see Indigenous involvement actually be formalized in the form of, sometimes First Nations owned and operated casinos with tribal gaming authorities overseeing them and so forth. In Ontario, we don't have that model. Our approach pretty much right from the very start has been exclusively focused on revenue sharing. We've had a couple of land-based properties that have been hosted by First Nations communities, which has been a little bit different. But generally speaking, the model in Ontario historically has been that there's a dedicated share of revenue, just under 2% of all gaming revenues in the province, that is distributed to First Nations and goes toward community development, education, healthcare, cultural development, and on down the line. So we've had a very strong, good relationship in that respect historically. With respect to iGaming, as I said at the outset, there's going to be a dedicated stream of consultation and discussions with Ontario's Indigenous communities for the purpose of determining how that historical approach maps onto the iGaming market. So that's to be seen in 2021.
Ron, let's just maybe turn our minds to the elephant in the room here. The Mohawk territory of Kahnawake has been operating for years on the premise that it falls outside of the Canadian Criminal Code. And so while I expect that your response may be speculative here, how do you think Kahnawake licensees will view the iGaming model, and how do you think Ontario will consider Kahnawake licensees?
Yeah, that is the elephant in the room here. Well, I think what we could do is we could look at Kahnawake as perhaps part of the larger offshore industry that's active in Canada. In fact, that industry is operating in many respects on the same principles that Kahnawake registered operators or Kahnawake licensed operators are operating on. And in particular, it's this shared argument that the gaming and betting provisions of the criminal code have no extraterritorial application to them. The challenge that we're seeing among our offshore clients that are properly situated offshore, that are making the argument that the gaming and betting provisions don't apply to them, albeit I should say that it's an untested argument, meaning that we don't have any jurisprudence on it. It's never been before the courts, specifically on that point. That's predicated on the ability to argue that you're properly offshore. So if you have a situation where you are both offshore and now you're licensed by the AGCO, well, I'd say that would probably erode your position that you're fully offshore. And perhaps it would open you to the application of Part 7 of the Criminal Code. And I think the same analysis could apply in the case of Kahnawake licensees. Whether or not the KGC is going to carry on business as usual, speculative. I expect they will. I expect that they will stand by their claim of sovereignty, which has a legal foundation, I should say. And I don't see any changes there. Whether or not those licensees will at the same time apply for a license with the AGCO, I think that could be problematic, and those licensees are probably going to have to adopt a different strategy.
And so just on the topic of offshore operators, they're traditionally viewed as having somewhat of an advantage in that they don't have to pay taxes to the Canadian government. They can offer single game sports, which we don't currently have, but we're working towards, and we'll get more into that topic. How do you think the offshore operators are going to view the iGaming model in Ontario? And I'm just wondering if you see it as a benefit, perhaps a disadvantage, particularly since right now they can accept play from all of Canada, but there aren't any other provinces really implementing anything similar to Ontario at this time.
Yeah, good question. I think we could look at the United States as a really helpful illustrative example. When PASPA was repealed, there was a lot of talk about the offshores there and how they're not going to go out of business and so forth. But what we've increasingly seen is that a large portion of the gaming industry has moved to licensed and regulated operators in the United States. And not just that, but some of the larger ones have pulled out of the market. Most notably, Five Dimes cut a deal with the DGE and is entering the market with a lawful partner. So I expect that will be the same. The calculus of, do I open up in Ontario and sacrifice the rest of the country revenue? I don't think it's a purely economic argument. And again, we've seen that in the United States. We've seen repeatedly operators ostensibly sacrifice 49 states for the benefit of New Jersey. But they're doing that because they're holding a long-term vision that, a regulated markets approach always has the most longevity. And that is the way to go if you want to be a resilient company that's a responsible operator in the community. If you want to access conventional capital, if you want to raise financing and so forth. The other thing I'll say is that offshore operators are really hamstrung in terms of their ability to openly advertise and market in Canada. There's only so much that they can do in terms of direct marketing, whereas I imagine that an AGCO licensed operator will be able to advertise their business just as any business could, subject, of course, to some of the responsible gaming issues that'll come to play.
Great. So, Paul, you've spoken on this. Sorry?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Paul, my next question is directed towards you. I know you've spoken a lot on this topic, particularly when it comes to single event sports betting, which will be our next topic. How do you think offshore operators will be impacted by the iGaming model in Ontario? And do you think that the offshore market will ever completely disappear?
I don't think it'll ever disappear, because I always think there will be some out there in jurisdictions that don't want to participate in any regulated market and happy to stay on the fringes. But I also think the question that in terms of the impact and what Ron just talked about, I don't know if we need to assume at this point in time that the operators will have to leave the rest of Canada. And I think that that's a question that's worthy of discussion. And it's as right now, there's many operating in Canada that hold licenses in the UK and other jurisdictions, and where there isn't a regulatory regime to sign up for. Regulators have sort of taken the position, well, based on the law in Canada. And I think that it poses a question of, this is an interesting point of discussion going forward, is that in fact required? Be given that why should Ontario sacrifice potentially the benefits and the fulsome of the potential of their market to satisfy other jurisdictions in Canada that aren't wanting to deal with the issue? And I think I think there are impacts on that. And I think that that's a question for Ontario to answer in this process, because in essence, they may be sacrificing some of the potential of their own market to assist other provinces that don't want to do their own public policy work. And I think that that's a question I think is an important one that needs to be discussed, I think, from an Ontario point of view, and what they're willing to do based on if other jurisdictions are free to set up their own regulatory regimes and entertain the way they want. And I think that's I think this is a point I don't think we should bypass too quickly in this part of the discussions going forward, and because I think it is an important one for the potential of the Ontario market.
Great. Well, thanks for all your comments on those topics. We hope that there's some clarity on some of these issues moving forward as things continue to develop. Our next topic is Bill C-218, the Safe and Regulated Sports Betting Act. Bill C-218 is Canada's third attempt to legalize single event sports betting in this country. And so much has changed since the previous attempts to legalize were put forth, including endorsement at the government level, sports leagues being on board, and industry experts being on board, as well as our U.S. neighbors legalizing in several states. Kevin, I believe you're on. My first question is directed to you, but perhaps you can briefly introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, you can hear me okay, I believe. I'm Kevin Waugh, the Member of Parliament for Saskatoon Grasswood. So I've been a Member of Parliament for 5 years, and I picked up actually Brian Massey's bill from the last Parliament, single game betting. How the private members' business works is everybody is into a pool and they pick numbers corresponding to MPs, and I drew number 7, lucky 7 in this case, because I moved forward with legislation, Bill C-218, single game betting. I introduced it in February, first reading, And because of COVID, we probably could have got this thing to the Senate by June, but then COVID arrived March 13th. Parliament shut down, the government prorogued, and it wasn't until November 3rd that I had second reading of the bill in the House of Commons. And then, as you all know, last Wednesday, David Lametti, the Justice Minister, took over my bill. Instead of a private member's bill now, it is a government bill, C-13. So first reading was last Thursday, I believe, and now second reading is moving very quickly. We're going to go next Wednesday in the House of Commons. Debate will start at 3:15, and so you can see the government is moving ahead. The difference between my bill and the government's bill, the amendment was they're going to protect horse racing. I did not have that in the original bill, C-18. There was no protection for the horse racing industry, while David Lametti has Minister Beeble from the agriculture side seconding this bill for protection for racetracks in Canada.
Kevin, just on that note, when it comes to horse racing, what are your thoughts on it being excluded?
Well, I know I had a long conversation with Jim Lawson and Woodbine yesterday. I was taking some heat in the early going of this bill because of Marcos Downs and so on. But I knew this bill, you know, the more you add to a private member's bill, the less chance you have to pass it. And that's why I just wanted to make it simple to the criminal code, remove that, give the provinces the jurisdiction to move ahead with single game betting. And I've received a lot of feedback from the racing industry. But at the same time, the conversations I had with many tracks in Canada, they must start the dialogue with the provincial governments. It is the provincial jurisdiction to deal with this. And as you know, in Ontario, they give hundreds of millions of dollars to racetracks, well over 125 million. And Gurdevad, I mean, they've been doing it for a long time. It's an industry that has needed support. And so I wasn't going to bring the horse racing into this conversation. Would have it come up with amendments if it did pass the House of Commons? It would have gone to the Justice Committee. And then it could have been bogged down with several groups, including the horse racing industry, trying to get the amendments into the bill at the Justice Committee. But that is the difference between my bill and the one David Lametti introduced last week on the government side.
Thanks for that. Paul, you've also been a force in regards to the potential legalization of single event sports betting. What are your thoughts on the bill, the progress, and how legalization is going to impact the industry?
I was muted, sorry. We're grateful for Kevin's work in keeping this on the parliamentary agenda. It's been terrific, and we've, I think with now the efforts on behalf of many in the industry, we've had a great coalition of support from business, labor, the gaming industry, the communities in which we operate in, and many of the sports stakeholders now to get us to this point. So we have a finish line actually in sight, which is the important part. We as the industry have been advocating through the spring and winter and summer on that this would be a great measure for the industry to have access to. Coming out of COVID, the industry's taken a tremendous hit in the last several months. In many parts of Canada, the gaming industry is not even open, casinos, and having a new product to offer to the public in Canada is very important. You combine this with Ontario's work and the online gaming regulatory framework that they're creating. You know, there's tremendous potential now for sports betting to take off in Canada, and I think that there's definitely demand from the public. And I think we'll see some of that potential come loose once we opportunity to get this passed, and hopefully by next fall they'll be able to have the measure in place across the country to give Canadians the access they've been looking for. It's been I think there's tremendous interest. I've talked to dozens of companies and operators and suppliers to the sector, the sports community. So everybody's looking for the potential and what they can gain off of this. And so tremendous time ahead, actually, in Canada.
Yes, very exciting times. Dave, from Ontario's perspective, do you think that Ontario will be ready to incorporate single event sports betting into the iGaming model if legalized?
Well, let me start by saying that Ontario has been an advocate for the legalization of single game sports betting for, Paul, at least a decade now, and probably longer. The initial private members bills, as Mr. Wong spoke to very briefly, the initial private members bills calling for the legalization of single game sports betting came from Brian Massey, and prior to him, Joe Cole-Martin, who were both members of Parliament for Windsor, which of course is the home of Caesars Windsor, and union representatives of the employees there have certainly been very vocal advocates. Of course, the major professional sports leagues who have been advocating more recently for this have a very significant presence in our province, and in particular in the city that I'm in right now, the city of Toronto, which is of course home of the world champion Toronto Raptors and Toronto Maple Leafs, who have not been a world champion for a much longer period of time, to our great dismay. But beyond that, I'll say that the AGCO, we have been long preparing for and looking at, anticipating the legalization of single game sports betting, and we'll be in a position to move as quickly as we need to. As Paul spoke to, Ontario is going to be actually an interesting, interesting jurisdiction within Canada, because we are moving to an open and competitive iGaming market. So that market question, that market balance question, is going to be a little bit different in Ontario. So some of those decisions will have to be made up front, and that will kind of give us our cue as to where we have to focus in on out of the gate. But our view is the regulatory framework that we have in place right now already addresses most of the processes and the regulatory risks that are present within single game sports betting. So we just see it as another vertical within the existing framework.
Ron, how do you think this change will impact some of the clients that you assist?
Well, I have to agree with the other panelists. I think it's a long time coming, and I think it's a positive change. I'd say that if the offshore operators have an advantage by way of being able to offer single event sports betting, that advantage is going to disappear. Certainly, the regulator here in BC is looking forward to that change as well. And, anything that they can do to operate on a more equal footing is something very encouraging. Is it going to drastically affect offshore operators? I don't think so. More locally, our local clients are probably looking forward to it. We represent quite a few technology companies who are offering more B2B solutions. And again, I think that that's a positive outcome for them too. Anytime you can diversify your offering, and more particularly give the market what it wants, that's a vote of confidence. So we fully support it.
Great, thank you, everyone. And so time is against us. We had a bunch of other topics we wanted to get to, so I'll limit it to our last one here. It's hard to discuss gaming in Canada without discussing COVID and the impact that it's had on the industry, particularly with the shutdown of many casinos across our country. And so because of the COVID shutdowns, many of us are relying on online outlets, whether it's to work remotely, play remotely, et cetera. And so a phrase that we've heard many times in this industry is cash is king. And so we're wondering if that really holds true, given all that's going on in the world today. Paul, I know that the Canadian Gaming Association has stated that the future of gaming is cashless. Can you tell us a bit about the proposed cashless wagering standards for Ontario that have been put together by the CGA, and what your thoughts are on those who say cash is still king?
Well, I think cash always will have a place in the gaming industry. I think that's clear. I think that it's never going to disappear. I think what we're going to see, though, is that we started the project last fall, about this time last year, pre-COVID, to talk about cashless wagering as a project of our Regulatory Innovation Committee, where we had actually participation from 6 regulators, plus industry and suppliers, to talk about the issues around cashless wagering, look at the technology that's available and coming. And through that process, it was, we understood that consumer preferences were changing. There's a generation that don't carry cash very much anymore. They use their mobile devices to pay for their way through their days. So we knew it was coming, and knew the industry needed to be involved and ahead of the curve, so we're not behind with our preferences for what customers, how they want to interact with our business. And so it comes for the cashless on the land-based side was our focus, and we've had a tremendous response from industry, and it dovetailed at the end with the cashless standards that were brought in Nevada. The folks at GLI were a great support to the committee. We have a great group of people that spent a lot of time taking a hard look. We've done consultations with the responsible gaming community, with FinTrack, to ensure that the standards reflect really what's the latest on regulation as when it turns to FinTrack, but also giving the operators the flexibility to implement the technology as quickly as they can, because obviously it's now taken on a more heightened need as people are looking to be able to respond to their customers and being able to use payment technology they want to use.
Dave, do you have any comments on the standards from an AGCO perspective?
Yeah, I certainly do. I'll say as a general proposition, the AGCO is very much oriented to welcome new and innovative products as they come along. And at least from our very parochial perspective, feel like we've been over the years quite responsive to some of these innovations and adjusting our technical standards to welcome these innovations into the marketplace. And we've been very actively involved with Paul's organization and with the working group that was set up to develop some of these minimum technical standards. We've already indicated, quite frankly, to prospective suppliers who've reached out to our in-house gaming lab that we welcome submissions for the review of these technologies at the same time as we're committed to working with the CGA and GLI and the folks on that group for the purpose of continuing to shape their technical standards. So the bottom line is that we are absolutely prepared to get this moving as quickly as the market is ready for it. And quite frankly, we feel like our technical standards that we have in place, which are again standards based and risk focused, are flexible enough to be able to address these technologies already.
Are there any final comments on the cashless wagering topic from any of the other panelists? No? Okay, great. So time is really against us here. I see there are a slew of questions that came in. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get to them. Perhaps SBC can coordinate with some of the attendees to circulate some of those questions, and we can get back to them with some answers. So on that note, it was a pleasure having the opportunity to speak with our panelists today about the evolving gaming space in Canada. Thank you to the panelists, to the audience for tuning in, and to SBC for organizing this conference. So thank you again, and cheers to future developments in the gaming space in Canada.
Thanks, Chantal.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.